Here, we'll be working with gradients. A gradient fill is a graduated blend of two or more colors, and it always includes a starting color and an ending color. You can create different types of gradient fills in Illustrator, including linear, in which the beginning color blends into the ending color along a line, and also radial, in which the beginning color radiates outward from the center point to the ending color. So let's start working with our file here. I'm going to select that yellow shape on the jellyfish with my selection tool. And in the Properties panel, I'll click the Fill button to bring up the Swatches panel, and I'll choose the gradient swatch named White Black. And there it fills that shape with that basic gradient. Now we'll work on editing this gradient. I'm going to click the Fill Color in the Properties panel again to show the swatches if it's not still there. I'm going to click the Gradient Options button at the bottom of the panel. And there we see our gradient panel. I'm going to double-click the black color stop to the far right of the gradient slider, and that will open up a color panel. I want to make sure that it is CMYK, so I'll click the Menu button in the top right corner. And I'll select CMYK. Now I'll change those CMYK values to a C of 1, an M of 97, Y to 21, and K to 0. So that's changed our gradient nicely. I want to make sure that the fill box is selected in the gradient panel. And now I'll double click the white leftmost gradient stop. And I want to make sure that the swatches button is selected. And I'll click to select the dark purple swatch that's named dark purple. There it is. So that's made a nice gradient change to our shape. Now we'll save the gradient because we may want to use it again. So in the gradient panel, I'm going to click the gradient menu arrow to the left of the word type, and then click the Add to Swatches button at the bottom of the panel. There's that icon, Add to Swatches. I'll just click that, and that will add it to our Swatches panel. Now with the jellyfish shape still selected, I'm going to click the Fill Color in the Properties panel. And I'm going to double click the new Gradient Swatch 1 that I just created. That brings up a dialog box, and I'm going to change the name to Jelly 1 and just click OK. Now I'm going to click the Show Swatch Kinds menu in the Swatches panel, and I'm going to choose Show Gradient Swatches. So I can isolate my swatches by type. Show Gradient Swatches. And now it shows me just the gradient. And with that shape still selected, I'm just going to play around with these swatches and see how it changes the colors on that shape. But of course, I want to make sure that I end up with the Jelly 1 swatch. And then I'll click the Show Swatch Kinds menu button again, and I'll choose Show All Swatches. Now we'll work on adjusting the linear gradient fill. With the selection tool, I'm going to double click the shape that we're working on to enter isolation mode. And there we've entered isolation mode. I'm going to zoom in on this object so I can better see what I'm doing. And now I'll click the Edit Gradient button in the Properties panel. And that basically selects the gradient tool. And you can see now that there is a gradient annotator in front of this object. And that's what we're going to use to adjust the gradient. And the slider indicates the direction and duration of the gradient, and so we'll play around with that to adjust our gradient. Now I'm going to change the direction of the gradient, and I'm just going to click somewhere below the shape, click, hold, and drag up. So click, hold, and drag up, and you can see how it changes the direction of the gradient. Now I'm going to move my cursor just off the small black square at the top of the gradient annotator. And when a rotation icon appears, I'm going to drag to the right to rotate the gradient in the rectangle, and then I'll release my mouse button. So you can see there's a little circular icon there, and I can move it and change the angle of the gradient. Now I'll double click the gradient tool in the Tools panel, and I want to make sure that the fill box is selected, and in the angle value I'll change it to 80. So we can more precisely determine the angle of our gradient. Now I'm going to choose Object, and then Lock, and Selection to lock the shape so that I don't accidentally move it around. And now I'll just switch to the Selection tool and press the Escape key to exit isolation mode. I'll zoom out so I can see the entire artboard. And with the Selection tool selected, we're now going to apply a linear gradient to a stroke. And we can create some interesting effects doing that. I'm going to select the light orange squiggly path in the lower right corner of our artwork, which is just a stroke. And then I want to be sure to click the stroke box at the bottom of the Tools panel to make sure that we're working on the stroke. And then I'll click the gradient box just below that to apply the last gradient that I used. And you can see it applied that gradient. It's made it a little bit more interesting. Now in the gradient panel, I want to make sure that the stroke is forward so that we're working on that. I'm going to leave the type as linear gradient, but I want to click the Apply Gradient across the stroke. We can see that we have different options here for how we can apply the gradient to a stroke. I'll click some of these to see the effect. But I want to make sure that I end up with the Apply Gradient across stroke. And you can see how it gave quite a bit more dimension to the stroke. And now I'm going to move my pointer below the gradient slider between the two color stops. And when I see a plus sign next to my pointer, I'm going to click to add another color stop. There's my plus sign, and all I have to do is click, and I've added a new color stop. I'm going to double click that new color stop to bring up the swatches panel. And I'm going to choose the swatch named pink. There it is. And you can see we've again added another dimension to our stroke. I want to make sure it's in the precise location. So I'm going to make sure that my location is right at 50%. Now I'm going to hold down my Alt key or the Option key on a Mac, and I'm going to drag the darker color stop on the far left end to the right, and that will create an additional color stop. So I'm holding down my Alt key on a PC or the Option key on a Mac, click, hold, and drag to the right until it's approximately in a 90% location. And again, notice how it's changed the color of our stroke. So now we've got 4 color stops. I actually want to remove one of them. So I'm going to drag the lighter color stop on the far right. I'm going to drag it down away from the gradient slider. When I see that it's gone, I can just release the mouse button to remove it. Now I'm going to double click the new color stop, and in the swatches panel I'm going to select the light pink color to apply it. I'll close these panels, and you can see that we've created a really interesting gradient to that stroke there that gives it a little bit of three-dimensionality. Now we'll work with a radial gradient. And a radial gradient is where the starting color is in the center and the ending color is on the outer edge of the circle. I'm going to click to select the pink background shape that's filling the artwork. Make sure that my fill box is forward. And I'll change the fill color to the white-black gradient in the Properties panel. There, I've done that. And now I want to change the gradient type from linear to radial. So I'll click that button in the Properties panel, and there you can see the effect of the radial gradient. Now I'll double-click the Gradient tool in the Tools panel to open up the Gradient panel. You can see the gradient annotator there, how there is a dotted circle around it. And in the Gradient panel, I'm going to click the Reverse Gradient button to swap the white and black colors in the gradient. You can see what a difference that made. Now I'll move the pointer over the gradient slider in the ellipse, and I'll double-click the black color stop in the center of the ellipse to edit the color. That's the beginning of our radial gradient. So I'll double-click that to change the color. And I'll select the swatch named light blue. Now I'll move the pointer beneath the gradient slider in the middle, and when I see that plus sign next to my cursor, I'm going to click to add another color stop. I'll double-click that new color stop, and in the Swatches panel, I'll choose the swatch named blue. And now I'll change its location to 45%. Now I'll double-click the white color stop on the far right to change that color, and in the Swatches panel, I'll choose dark blue. So that's looking a lot better. Now we'll work on adjusting the radial gradient. Now with the gradient tool selected as well as the rectangle still selected, I'm going to move the pointer near the upper left corner of the artboard. Then I'll click and drag down to the lower right corner of the artboard to change the direction of the gradient. That looks a lot better. It looks like the light is coming from above there. Now I want to adjust the circle around here. And I can't quite see all of the circle around my gradient annotator, so I'm going to zoom out a few times. Now I'm going to move my pointer over the double circle on the dashed circle. And when I see my pointer change, I'm going to drag toward the center of the artboard a little bit. And what that does, it shortens the gradient. You can see how it's making that circle a little bit smaller. Now, in the gradient panel, I want to make sure that the fill box is selected, and I'm going to change the aspect ratio to 80%. And that will turn the circle into more of an ellipse shape. You can see when I move my pointer over the gradient annotator how that dotted circle is now more of an ellipse. So I think we've done a nice job adjusting that radial gradient. I'll fit my artboard in the window and deselect everything. Now we're going to apply gradient to multiple objects. We can do that all at once. We're going to do that to those kind of seaweed shapes there. So with my selection tool, I'm going to click the purple seaweed artwork in the lower left corner to select that. And now I want to select all the same shapes with that same fill color. So I'll go up to Select, Same, and over to Fill Color. And now all of those shapes are selected. And I'm going to select the gradient tool. Well, first I'll make sure that the swatches button, I'll open my swatches and I'm going to fill it with the plant gradient swatch. So with those objects selected, open up the swatch panel and I'll choose the plant gradient swatch. And there it's filled all of those shapes with that gradient swatch. And now I'll select my gradient tool and you can see that each of those shapes has its own gradient annotator on it. And I just want to change the direction, and I can do that quite easily by getting my gradient tool, and I'm just going to click, hold, and drag from the upper right corner of the artboard to the lower left, and that will change the gradient on all of the shapes. And I want to reduce, you can see how I can move that around and change it, but I'll just go from the upper right to the lower left. And now with all the shapes still selected, I'm going to change the opacity value in the Properties panel to 30%. So now we'll add some transparency to gradients, and that can create a really interesting effect here. I'm going to select that green shape. And in the gradient panel, I want to make sure that the fill box is selected. And I'm going to click the gradient menu arrow and select the white black to apply that generic gradient to the fill. So I'll just use that basic gradient to fill that green shape. And now with the gradient tool, I'll drag from the top edge of the shape to just past the bottom edge at a slight angle to change the direction of the gradient. And now I'm going to double click the black color stop on the gradient annotator, and I'm going to select the light blue from the swatch panel. And then I'll change the opacity to 0%. Now I'll double click the white color stop at the other end of the gradient slider, and I'll also choose the light blue color from the swatches panel. And this time I'll choose 70% from the opacity menu. And then I'll drag the bottom blue color stop a little bit up to shorten it a little bit. And now you can see how that shape kind of fades into the background color, and that's kind of the point behind doing the transparency. Now we'll work on creating a freeform gradient, which is, as its name implies, a very freeform gradient where we can add and subtract sort of various gradients randomly. We don't necessarily have to limit ourselves to a linear or radial gradient. So I'm going to select that white shape. I'll zoom in a little bit. And I'll select the gradient tool. And then on the Properties panel, I'll select the Freeform Gradient option. So I've selected that. And you can see now that there are some gradient stops sort of randomly placed into that shape. I'm going to double click the color stop on the left lower side of that shape to change the color. And I'm going to choose the dark purple swatch. And now I'm just going to click, hold, and drag that dark purple color stop to the bottom center of the shape. So I can move these stops anywhere I want to within the shape. I don't have to be limited to either the linear or radial gradient slider like we've been doing. Now I'm going to add another color stop, so I'm just going to click towards the top of the shape, which added another gradient stop. I'll double click it and add, I'll choose the yellow swatch. I want to change the dimension of that purple stop that I just had. I'm going to move my cursor over it, and I see that dotted circle around it. And I'll move my cursor down to the little stop, that icon at the bottom there. It's a little widget, and I can click, hold, and drag that. And that will increase the size of that gradient area. It kind of spreads it out a little bit. I'll click somewhere in the shape over towards the left here to add another color stop. I'll double click it and change the color to pink. Now in the gradient panel, I'm going to choose the color picker. It looks like a little eyedropper. And then I'll sample a color somewhere in that shape to change that color stop to that color, whatever color I land on. So you can see how this free form gradient really can become very complex and create a very multi-dimensional shape. With my gradient tool still selected, I'm going to drag the color stop down towards the bottom right, and I'll just click, hold, and drag it over to the left a little bit. I'll double click it, and I'll change the color to purple. Now in the gradient panel, I'm going to change the way we manipulate this freeform gradient. I'm going to choose lines. And you'll see what happens in a minute. I'm going to click the purple color stop that I just changed. And now, when I move my cursor, you can kind of see a little direction line, not unlike the pen tool direction line. So when I drag up, you can see the direction that the gradient is going to go. And I'll just move the pointer to the center of the shape and just click to add a new color stop there. I'll double click that new stop and fill it with the purple swatch. And now I'll click just to the lower right of that last color stop towards the bottom of the shape to add another color stop so you can see how complex this is becoming. And I'll go back to that center color stop, move it around a little bit. You can see how easily we can really add a great deal of dimensionality and complexity to our gradient. So we did a lot of work with gradients that really helped to add a lot of depth and dimension to our artwork.